Welcome to the Michigan Minds Podcast, a quick and informative analysis of today's top issues from University of Michigan faculty.
I am a professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education in the School of Public Health, and I am also the Associate Director of the Detroit Community Academic Urban Research Center. I've been interested in understanding how racism affects health in African American, Black young people. Adolescents and young adults have been the main populations that I've looked at. And I've been really interested in understanding how do experiences like racial discrimination lead to increases in negative mental health. I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, but I've also been interested in understanding how these things relate to physical health as well. So in our work, we've looked at the links between the frequency with which youth experience discrimination and how that affects things like depressive symptoms, anxiety, how stressed the youth feel. We've even looked at, how much trouble they're getting into at school as examples of kind of psychological behaviors. And then also more recently, kind of health-related behaviors. So things like blood pressure, cardiovascular function, those types of things. So a primary goal is to really look at that link between racism and health. Over the course of my career, we've, pretty much been able to detail that there's a connection and it's a bad one. And so I've also been interested in understanding what types of things can disrupt the link between racism experiences and health in young people. And my work has tended to focus on cultural factors that allow you to be resilient. So thinking about things like racial identity, how important is being Black to a kid? What does it mean to be African American? There's evidence that protects against some of the negative effects of discrimination. I've also been interested in something we call racial socialization. So that's how do parents talk to their kids about race? And are there specific messages that can mitigate some of the negative effects of discrimination on negative mental health outcomes? So, if I had to kind of sum it up in a couple of strands, it would really be what is the link between racism experiences like discrimination in health and what are cultural factors that can kind of protect against some of the negative mental health effects and physical health effects of discrimination and racism. As a psychologist, I've been interested for a really long time in racism at the individual level, which is oftentimes referred to as racial discrimination. And we know that racial discrimination is linked with a number of deleterious mental health outcomes. So any psychological mental health problem you can think of, there's probably been a study linking discrimination to that negative outcome in Black youth. So things like increase in depressive symptoms, increases in anxiety, distress. I mentioned earlier things like heightened stress, higher blood pressure, higher, problems with your heart. And, we know a lot more about the relationship with older African Americans in terms of, cancer and a number of health disparities. It's linked to life expectancy, so on and so forth. But we think that racism and discrimination begins to impact folks very early on in life. And as they leave home and are exposed to more stressors, that increases the total stress burden, which in turn has implications for their health. There are a number of studies that suggest that this pattern starts very early on in life. It's not something that just happens, in adulthood, but even by the time folks are entering adulthood, young adults, there have been studies linking discrimination experiences to markers that are linked to how long you're going to live. And so the stress that is associated with discrimination is one of the primary mechanisms by which discrimination is believed to influence both mental and physical health. Okay, so that's one primary way that discrimination is linked to mental health. One of the things I've been increasingly interested in is that we know racism is not only operating at an individual level, so person to person, but there are ways in which racism operates at an institutional level or a cultural level, some of the languages, symbols, media that we see, and those things have implications as well. So if you think about institutional racism, I know there's a lot of discussion right now around the police and the justice system, but think about things like segregation, which impact people's access to employment and education opportunities. They have implications for people's access to quality health care. And so, another way in which racism and racial discrimination experiences can influence health is through an impact on what people have access to. We know also that employment and education are linked with health outcomes. So, even though that's not person to person discrimination, someone calling someone a racial epithet, racism at those other levels also has implications for health. What we've seen in terms of some of the racial health disparities with Black and African American populations is not really new. It's consistent with other patterns that we've seen with a host of other diseases that we are familiar with. So the pattern itself is not new. I think that it's played out in some different ways, in part due to kind of the unique circumstances around COVID in terms of the isolation that people are experiencing, in terms of social distancing, and thinking about some of the practices that are necessary to prevent COVID from spreading. So in terms of having access to clean water brings up discussions around institutional and environmental racism, for example. And so I don't, again, know that there's anything new here, but it's forced us to kind of think about unique ways in which some of the stress burden that African Americans experience is exacerbated by the disease. I'll give you another example that's been quite of interest in recent months with regard to African American youth in particular is the issue of loss. So we know that African Americans are disproportionately affected and more likely to know someone who has been diagnosed and actually died from COVID, and to lose family members. And so that has implications for parents being lost, losing caretakers. And we know that when you lose someone early on in life, that's actually associated with more negative health outcomes later on. So again, that's not a new finding. We know that loss is associated with poor health outcomes, but COVID is unique in that it raises these additional kinds of stressors that are well associated with negative mental health outcomes and health in general. I'll just add one more piece to this conversation, and that is that for many youth of color and African American youth, the primary, sort of medium that they receive mental health services is in their schools. And so you can imagine with the closing of schools and with the move to distance learning, there's a limit to people being able to access some of the strategies that are well known for helping them navigate stress and difficult circumstances. And so if folks don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to everyday counselors, it raises real concerns about what the toll may be on African American youth's mental health down the line. Part of the definition of structural racism is that it's part of the fabric of society. It's part of the air we breathe. And so in terms of its impact on that, I certainly don't think it's going to make it go away or mitigate it. If anything, it might kind of reinforce some of the structures that are already there. One of the things that I was interested in a couple weeks ago is when I read about the CARES Act and how it was not available to everyone. So essential workers, for example, were not eligible for some of the unemployment benefits. This also is the case for immigrant populations who do not have access to some of the policies and sort of law that's been put in place to offer support. And so, what is the impact of COVID on structural racism? If you have these kinds of programs, policies, and interventions that don't provide protections to the people who most need it, what you're going to continue to see is a sort of reinforcement of those structures that kind of, privilege certain people in our country over others. We know that in times of economic downturn, there are, if we go back to 2008, for example, mental health really goes on the decline. There's actually an interesting finding where overall, when we looked at mental health following 2008 economic downturn, it was stable. If you look at it at a population level, and it actually improved in some cases. But when you looked at the people in society who were less resourced, you saw that an increase in mental health problems and mental health decline. And so it's really important that we pay attention to all levels and all people and all populations because the effects of COVID are not going to be the same for everyone in the community. I think that people need to understand that structural racism is a root cause, it's a root factor that explains a lot of the reasons that we see. If I talk about COVID-19 for a second, many of the disparities play out. So when we originally started to think about, what are some of the contributing factors that explain these racial health disparities, people focused on things like chronic or underlying conditions. They talked about occupational vulnerability in terms of the types of jobs that people are exposed to that require continuous interaction with the public. They talked about inadequate access to testing, et cetera, et cetera. It wasn't until a few weeks after some of those original discussions that many folks who study racism started to say, yes, those factors are important, but structural racism is at the root of many of those explanations. Well, some of the reasons that poverty exists and that there's a differential have to do with the fact that there's a long-standing tradition in our country of privileging whiteness and privileging certain groups over others. Some groups are considered superior, others inferior, often Blacks or people of color. And so some of the reasons that we have the chronic underlying conditions and racial disparities that we see have to do with the economic and other policies that have been longstanding in place, things like segregation, things like Jim Crow, that positioned certain communities to not have access to things that are required for health. And so that's problematic. If you think about American Indian populations, for example, they've really been hit. They don't have the infrastructure in terms of healthcare. Well, that's not through any doing of their own. It's because there's a pattern of genocide, unfortunately, in our country that led to them being, many put on reservations or in places that don't have access to the same resources. So I think what I would say is that, some people don't want to talk about racism. They get very upset about using that word. We can have a debate or argument about what you want to call it, but I don't think anyone would disagree with the fact that there have been longstanding kind of policies in our country that have advantaged and disadvantaged certain groups. And those things sort of influence who has access to things that promote health. One thing that I like to remind folks is that despite the links between racism, structural racism, and its negative impact on health, we know that there are multiple ways and multiple mechanisms, multiple levels, individual, institutional, cultural, that really get under the skin and get in the mind. We also know that this pattern of unfortunate circumstances is not new to African Americans or Blacks or people of color, but I always like to end with a little bit of hope And that is to remind folks that Black people and African American people in this country have endured years, hundreds of years of mistreatment and negative societal policies, but still have managed to be resilient and strong. And so I am hopeful that even as we head into this new chapter in which COVID-19 has reinforced some of the structural racism and exacerbated these health disparities, that we will find new ways to address the root cause, and that Black people and other communities of color will emerge resilient and with the same health outcomes and health equity that other groups experience.
Thank you for listening to the Michigan Minds Podcast, a production of the University of Michigan. Join the conversation on social media with #UMichImpact.